Welcome back everyone. On my last video I showed you how to quilt your large quilt, and I did this beautiful scrappy quilt, and in this video we're going to learn how to put the binding on. I've already made the binding, so I'll first show you how to make this binding and then I'll show you how to attach it to your quilt so that you have a finalized quilt.
Welcome to my channel. My name is Rachel and it's time to sew. First you need to cut some strips of fabric. My strips were 2 3/4 of an inch wide. I used to do 2.5 inch strips, that also works, but I decided to try a little thicker this time because I'd heard of a friend of ours that did 3-inch strips, and so anyway I thought I'd give that a go. 2 3/4. Then you need to sew those strips together with a diagonal seam, and how you do that is you put your two ends of your strips at right angles to each other and have a overhang of around 1 centimeter, or a 1/4 inch is fine as well. Then you need to stitch a line from corner to corner. You need to make sure that you are sewing this line in the correct way, because if you sew the line the other way it won't work. Basically you want to have a triangle that you can cut off on that corner there, so you're sewing so that the corner gets cut off is the way you can think about it. I'm just trimming then away, leaving a 1/4 inch, and as you can see that leaves a perfectly straight piece of fabric. So I'll show you that again. We get one piece of fabric, we get our next strip and place that over the top on perpendicular, just cutting off the selvage there. One on top of the other with a slight overhang of 1/4 inch or 1 centimeter, as long as it's even. I don't chalk a line, but you could draw this line in. But basically I just line up my corners so they're straight on the machine, and I am looking at the corner as I'm sewing towards it. And then as you can see, it makes a beautiful straight piece of binding with a diagonal seam. Beautiful. Then we iron those seams. Either to one side is fine, but I actually iron my seam open just to reduce bulk even more. And then we need to fold this piece of binding in half on itself all the way down the length. So I've obviously cut enough strips and sewn them together to go around the whole perimeter of my quilt, so all 4 sides plus extra for when you're joining. And so now you just spend the whole couple of minutes ironing in half and ironing your seams open as you go along, and hopefully you haven't made any mistakes and they are all facing the same way and you don't have to undo any and redo them. A nice hot iron. I have steam on, and I just put it on the cotton setting. And the reason for this is so that you have a double amount of fabric going over your binding, because the edge of your quilt will get wear and tear and you want your binding to be thick.
And here is a quilt I made 20 years ago, and this is why you do a double binding. It is worn through on the first layer but not the second. You're going to start stitching your binding on halfway down one side, and you're going to leave 30 centimeters, 12 inches of the binding that you don't sew. So you're going to start sewing the binding on around here. So I'm going to place the raw edges of my binding against the raw edges of my quilt. I'm going to do a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. I'm using the 1 centimeter line here. It's because this is slightly larger than I normally do. When I do a 2.5 inch strip, folding in half, I just do the 1/4 inch seam allowance. But I thought I'm going to make a centimetre. I've done the measurement. When I fold that over and over, I'll still have enough. So 1 centimetre it is. So needle down. You can use the walking foot or a regular foot. I've just got my regular foot on for this because it has a smaller foot and it's just easier for me. And I've got a 2.5 stitch length. Okay, and then I'm simply going to start stitching down. I will show you what to do at a corner. Let me get there first.
In the last video that I posted on YouTube, I showed how to quilt a large quilt using your domestic machine, and specifically we used a walking foot for straight line stitching with this quilt, as well as some design work. I wanted to say hello and thank you to all the new subscribers who jumped on board on the last video to watch me make this quilt, and to all my lovely followers, subscribers, audience that make lovely comments every video. Thanks so much.
Okay, when you approach a quarter, go slowly. You want to stop about a centimetre in my case, because that's my seam allowance. If you're doing a 1/4 inch, do a 1/4 inch from the edge. But basically you're going to be stopping a seam allowance worth from the end. So I've got about a centimetre there. I've got my needle down. I actually will do a few backward stitches here and cut my threads. Whoop, sorry everyone. I'm now going to turn my quilt around to do the next side. I'm trying not to hit the... Okay. You push your binding backwards, up away from your quilt, and make sure that this line here is perpendicular or straight with this line here. Okay, then it comes forward, and you want your forward facing binding to lay exactly along the binding that went back, so nice and straight. It will be straight across here, and the raw edges will line up with your raw edges on this side as well. Okay, back under here. Okay, starting a centimetre in, round about, needle down. I'm going to go forward and backward. I don't think I am, that'll be right, I've come undone. Try that again. Needle down. I will do some back stitches. Okay. And then you continue on until the whole quilt has been, the binding has been attached to the full quilt. Just showing you that corner again, I stopped stitching when I got a centimetre away from the edge. Then I turn my quilt. I flip the binding up away from the corner, and then I flip it back down, and I line up the fold along the top edge and the raw edge along the right hand side, along the raw edge of the quilt. And then I put my needle down 1 centimetre from the edge. I stitch and forwards and backwards, and then continue stitching. Stop stitching your binding when you get about a ruler's length away from the end. And to join the binding, you first need to lay the binding over top of each other, flat against the quilt and along the edge of it. So I've tried to make that nice and flat surface. You're going to measure an overlap that is the same width as your binding was. So my binding I cut at 2 3/4 of an inch. So I'm measuring an overlap of 2 3/4 and making a mark with my chalk pencil. So if you did 2.5 inch binding, you would measure 2.5 inch. If you did a 3-inch binding, you will measure 3 inches overlap. So I'm just double checking that and then cutting along that chalk line you just drew. Okay, then you need to join these two pieces of binding together. Move your quilt away and you're doing right sides together. So make sure that you have your binding right sides together. And you are placing those bindings together perpendicular as you did when you joined the binding at the beginning. This time I have no overlap. It is definitely just corner to corner, as you can see there. I'm going to pin in place because it does move around a bit, and I'm going to chalk my line this time. Get that quilt up so it doesn't slide around. So see, there is no overlap this time. It is simply edge to edge, and I'm going to draw that chalk line in this time, leaving a triangle corner that will be cut off. So exactly corner to corner, draw your white line or chalk line. And I'm simply going to stitch along that line. Okay, take my pins out. Before I cut that triangle off, I always double check to make sure it looks good. So when you spread your quilt out and fold it back in half, it should lay along the edge of your quilt and look good. And mine did, so I'll cut off that triangle. Okay, and lay, I think I was just opening up that seam, finger pressing it open. Sorry, my hands are in the way, you can't see what I'm doing. Okay, folded back together. Place it along the edge of my quilt. My quilt is nice and straight. And simply finish your stitch line.
A few days have passed. I got busy because in Australia it's the first week of school and I am a high school teacher. So last week I was preparing for class. Today I had my first classes with my year 7s, and that's their first year of high school, and it went really well. They're such great kids and I had a good day, but I have some time now. I've organised my rest of my week, and my son and my husband have gone off to footy training, so I have some time to get this finished, or at least finish this video. So we have already sewn the binding on with our machine, so the next step is to turn it over and to hand sew that down. So I'm going to use an overhead camera and film how I do that. Now before we do that though, I did want to talk about my email newsletter that I wanted to get started. I've talked about it in the last 2 videos, and thank you to the 5 people plus my mum who got on board and signed up for those emails. So I've written the email, but I went to send it and I needed a domain name, I needed a professional email, it wouldn't work with Gmail.
And then I went to get the domain. I wanted a .com.au, and I needed an ABN, an Australian business number. And then I was busy with school and it just hasn't happened yet. But I think I do want to do the emails and connect with you in that way, and have a newsletter where I'm sharing more of my thoughts about the quilts that I'm working on and the quilts that I want to do in the future. So there'll be a link below in the description. You can still sign up, and you might, depending on when you sign up, you might be on my list for my very first newsletter. But I can't say with 100% accuracy that it is going to happen, because I'm still trying to work it all out. But that's okay. So if you want to jump on, if I send an email, I send an email. If I don't, there's no harm done. It's free anyway for you to sign up. It's basically just giving your email to me. All right, let's do this hand sewing. So I need some needle and thread to begin with, and just a nice sharp needle will be fine. And I'm using a navy thread because I have a navy binding. So I'm using a new overhead camera holder, and I think I've been ripped off. So I bought it from eBay in Australia. I thought it was going to be taller, that's one thing. And the other thing, it has a light that's supposed to work, and it turns on for about 1 second and then turns off. And I've tried all different things and I can't get the light to work. So when I work it out, this will be brighter. But if I don't work it out, I've been scammed. Okay, I thought I'd show you a corner, because then I can show you what it looks like when we go around the corner. So let's trim off some of these threads. I always hand stitch the binding down because I like that process. But some people do, say, fold over their binding, right? And then stitch in the ditch along there and hope that they get their binding caught on the back as well. But I find it's always a bit of a gamble to do that, because you never know if it's going to move, and you slightly don't get the binding in the stitching. You've also got this stitch line here that the binding, you've got to cover that. So I find it easier for me to just do it by hand, and I find it's very relaxing anyway. So at the moment, what I'm doing is I'm using just my fingers of both hands to fold that over so that it is going away from your seam line and over, and it covers that navy stitch line, which is where I've put the binding on. Okay, and then I will just put, I think I'm actually going backwards. I am. Usually I do it that way. I'll be able to cope with this. So I put it through the binding first. I go down directly where I've come up, into the yellow, into the binding, into the quilt, but not through the quilt, just into the quilt, and run along a little bit. Let's go, what is that in inches? A 1/4 inch, and pull it up. Down directly into yellow, across, and then up through the navy. Down, and make sure it's over the, up through the navy, just on the edge there. So I hope that's, you're able to see that. So down directly where I've come out, but into the yellow, then along inside the quilt, up through the quilt and the edge of the binding into the navy, and pull nice and taut. Okay, I am coming up to an edge, a corner, and that's what I wanted to show you. So basically I just continue until I get to the seam line that's coming in. So I'll do a couple more to get to there. And I might shorten my stitches ever so slightly to make sure that that it's nice and secure at the corner. One and my last one, and it will come out at that junction. Okay. All right, now on this side, it has that diagonal seam there, that's fine. Or it's not a seam, it's just a fold. I want to make sure that the binding here is continuing on, and then I end up with a triangle piece over here and my other bit of binding. Then when I just sort of fold it over so that I now have a fold line here. So I've got a fold line there and I've got a fold line there. Okay, and it's covered the stitch line on both areas. These are just a few stitches that are not needed. Okay, I do a few stitches into my corner, into that fold on the diagonal, which you probably can't see what I'm doing right now because it is navy on navy, it's too dark. But basically I'm just putting a few stitches into that diagonal to secure that, using the same method I just used before. Okay, so I'm sure you probably can't see what I just did then. All right, then I'm on my way again, going down this side. So down directly and along inside the quilt and back up through the binding and pull tight. And I'm using this hand to roll this over and then hold it. You could roll over a few and clamp them with those little plastic clamps that you can buy. I just hold it with my hand, that's all right, fine with me. So down into the quilt, along and up through that binding and pull tight. Down, along and up. Down, along and up. And you get into a rhythm, you relax, you pop on your favorite TV show or movie, which I will be doing shortly, and before you know it, your whole quilt's complete. So that's how neat it is on the back side. I've covered my stitch line. This stitch line is covered. I cannot see my stitches because they're in the same color as my binding. And on the front side, it has a beautiful diagonal fold here, and the binding is an even consistency throughout. Lovely corner point, so I'm really happy with that quality of that. So I just continue doing that the whole way across, and you have a beautiful binding and your quilt is nearly finished.
All done. Love my new quilt. Hope you enjoyed this video. In the next few videos we'll go back to Mum's and finish her scrappy quilt. So we'll see you then. Bye everyone.